tehdään intro täältä keväisestä mettästä. Mä oon tässä vääntänyt 4. jaksoa ja nyt mennään teoretisoinnista vuoteen 2012 ja vähän niin kuin next level shittia, eli miten tää kaikki sai alkunsa. Tai miten tää dokkariprojekti nyt kähti liikkeelle. Ei kai tässä sen kummempaa. Let's dive in.
In the previous episode, the argument was that the letter to the Romans gave rise to the age of interpretation by articulating a universal narrative, one that began to fracture as it spread into different historical and cultural settings. This was the deeper impasse behind documentarists' failed thesis on spring of 2012. How can a text be interpreted as an object of study when it is the very force that produced the world in which such study takes place? From that deadlock, the documentary itself begins. A new idea takes shape, not to interpret the letter to the Romans directly, but to investigate the strange structure or reality to which it seems to point, by means of an autobiographical essay film. The question shifts accordingly. What does it mean to live inside a structure that is also at work within oneself? At that point, Paul's phrase "en Christo" begins to appear in a new light. The documentarian has already recognized the same underlying structure in lived experience. Human beings exist in the world, but the world also exists within them. One lives within life, and life within oneself. In Pauline scholarship, en Christo is widely understood as a local expression, not merely an abstract belief, but a way of naming the reality in which the apostle lives, and from within which the letter to the Romans is written. In Romans, Paul brings two ideas into a single movement: Apokalypsis and en Christo. Apokalypsis means unveiling the moment when a hidden structure becomes visible. What is unveiled is nothing else than the logic of restoration, a pattern within history that had been there all along but could not yet be seen clearly. And this unveiling does not remain outside the observer as doctrine or information. Paul's second phrase, en Christo, in Christ, names the condition of living within that newly visible reality. It is the shift from facing the story as something external to finding oneself already inside it. The essay film began from a simple hypothesis that Romans was not describing a narrowly religious reality, but a structure already present in ordinary human experience. What followed was an attempt to give that experience language.
Nythän me ollaan tämän tuotantokauden käänteessä. Climax-jakso. Enjoy.
Keissi ja kuninkaan paluu. Vapautta on ollut 2000 vuotta, vähän niin kuin shadeissä. Nyt vuosi 2012 odotamme.
Mä haluan tässä.
Jotain kytee. Jotain odotetaan. Chillisti.
The theme of the youth festival that summer was Return of the King. On stage, the message seemed clear to the speakers addressing the crowd. Christ would return. The second coming. The imagery was familiar. The sky opening. The Lord descending in the clouds. Language drawn largely from one of Paul's earliest letters.
Ei, mitä tulee mieleen? Jeesus tulee, olet pois. Ota koppi!
For centuries, this passage has shaped the dominant imagination of the end of history. Yet, a simple question emerges when Paul's own language is considered more carefully. If Paul speaks about an apocalypsis, an unveiling of reality, then the content of that unveiling cannot already be known, because the moment its content is described in advance. Nothing is actually unveiled when the moment arrives. That is why, when Paul later writes more systematic argument, the vocabulary begins to shift. Instead of describing a spectacle descending from heaven, Paul repeatedly uses the language of disclosure. 3 words appear throughout the text. Apokalypsis, the unveiling of what was hidden. Mysterion, a reality concealed until the right moment. Phaneroo, to make visible what was previously unseen. Many scholars have pointed out this transition. The early cosmic imagery begins to look like a provisional language. In his later texts, the cosmic vocabulary fades, and the focus turns to the drama unfolding within history itself. In this sense, parousia, the public presence of a ruler, and apocalypsis, unveiling, may describe the same moment from 2 perspectives. The presence of authority becoming visible. This also sheds light on another central term in Paul's letters, pistis, faith. It means living in expectation before the unveiling takes place. Faith, therefore, belongs to the time when the meaning of events remains hidden. Believers, like everyone else, live within that same horizon. They anticipate that something will one day become visible, but they do not yet know what the unveiling will show. Therefore, faith is not the possession of the answer. It is the willingness to wait until the answer becomes visible to the whole world.
Se, mitä me tiedetään, mitä tapahtuu vuonna 2012 joulukuussa, on se, että Balunjok-niminen hahmo tulee esiin silloin, mutta missä hän tulee esiin ja mitä tapahtuu, niin se on todellakin murtunut tästä monumentista, joten tarkempaa tietoa siitä ei ole.
Here's another tantalizing piece of evidence. A brick discovered in the ancient Mayan ruins of Camalcalco that cites the year 2012. That's the exact same year mentioned on a 1,300-year-old tablet previously found among the nearby ruins of Tortuguero with this intriguing inscription.
It's basically saying that the deity Bolon Yokde-ku appears on December 21st of 2012, and he descends and he performs a ritual,
which has led some people to say these signs point to December 21st, 2012.
Okay, we'll make a movie.
For someone already fascinated by the idea of Apokalypsis, the unveiling, the coincidence was impossible to ignore. A date had appeared that seemed to promise the descent of a divine figure and a ritual marking the end of an age. The decision was simple: go and document the day. The destination was Jerusalem, chosen less for symbolism than for a practical reason. It was a familiar place where a place to stay could still be found in the landscapes of childhood. A 3-week volunteer position had been arranged in Jerusalem, working as a guest host at a small hostel in the very same building where the family had lived in the late 1970s. As the date approached, a small group of visitors planned a trip north. On December 20th, the documentarian drove the group toward Tiberias, acting as both driver and guide. The night was spent on the hills above the Sea of Galilee, a place the documentarian remembered from childhood.
Galilea, Lake Gennesaret. Ja tänään on 21.12.2012. Me olemme...
21.
Tänään on, joo.
3 päivää joulua.
3 päivää joulua.
The journey now turned south, back toward Jerusalem. According to the Gospels, the story had begun in these villages around the Sea of Galilee, where a carpenter from Nazareth gathered followers and spoke of the kingdom of God. The evangelists wrote to show that this man was the Messiah of Israel, the one promised in the scriptures of the prophets. But Israel, as a people, did not accept the evangelists' message, and the reason was clear. The Messiah was expected to bring restoration, not only spiritual comfort, but the restoration of Israel's former glory. He would restore the house of David, gather the scattered people, renew Jerusalem, and raise Israel once again to its rightful place among the nations. The Messiah would not simply speak about redemption. He would make restoration visible in history. But that had not happened. Rome still ruled. The kingdom was not restored. The people were not gathered. Jerusalem was not lifted up. So when the evangelists proclaimed that this crucified man was the promised Messiah, it did not sound like fulfillment, but contradiction. And it is precisely this contradiction that becomes the foundation of Paul's writing. In his reading of the promise first articulated in Genesis and carried forward through Moses, the words "all nations" are no longer understood as an extension of Israel's story, but as its original scope. What had been read as a national covenant is reframed as a statement about humanity as a whole. For Paul, the story does not begin with Israel. It begins before Israel, in the condition described in Genesis, prior to division, before the rupture, later named as the fall. A state of unity. Participation, not a theological abstraction, but a way of being, before separation, before language itself began to distinguish, to divide, to place the human being apart from the rest of existence. From this perspective, Adam is not the first figure in Israel's lineage, but the figure of humanity as such. And the rupture is not a historical misstep within one people's story, but a structural break, one that defines the human condition. This is the shift. Where Israel reads its scriptures as the history of a people, Paul reads them as the unveiling of a condition shared by all. And with that shift, the meaning of restoration changes. In the letter to the Romans, restoration is no longer described as the rebuilding of what was lost, but as the recovery of a relationship. The creation itself will be set free from its bondage to decay. What is restored is not a nation, nor a structure, but a condition. A return to participation, to a unity that precedes division. Yet this shift was not immediately seen. What had been understood in national terms did not disappear. It changed form. Where restoration had once been expected as the renewal of a people, it came to be expected as the renewal of a faith. The frame remained, the scale remained. Only its expression changed. What Israel had read as a national promise, the church would come to read as a religious one. And within that frame, the meaning of restoration remained bound to a people or to a belief. But in Paul's argument, the promise exceeds both. And the veil, in this reading, was not simply an obstacle, it belonged to the process itself. What was read as national and later as religious allowed the universal to remain hidden until it could be seen. The movement of history is no longer read as a sequence of events to be controlled, corrected, or fulfilled, but as a process through which restoration unfolds. Not by rebuilding what was lost, but through the very condition that seemed to deny it. Through decay, through limitation, through the collapse of every attempt to contain it within a single frame. And when this becomes visible, authority no longer appears as something external, held by a nation or a religion. It is present in the structure of the story itself. Not owned, not defended, but shared as participation.
So everything comes not by mistake, it comes on purpose.
If restoration concerns all creation, all peoples, then its scope must be universal. It cannot depend on a nation or a religion. The meaning of restoration must be attached to something that can be recognized wherever it appears, wherever something is broken or experienced as lacking. And it is. Everything that breaks is met with action. Everything that is maintained requires effort. What is repaired does not remain as it is. It requires constant attention, constant renewal. Nothing becomes whole in this way. It returns to the same condition. The same pattern appears across all scales. Nations engage in conflict in order to secure peace, yet the conflict continues. Religion is practiced to restore connection, yet what follows is not connection, but more practice, more effort directed toward what does not arrive. What is pursued is not reached. The movement continues. Paul recognizes the same logic in Romans 7. From verse 14 onward, he describes a condition in which human action turns against its own intention. The more urgently the will reaches toward its goal, the further that goal seems to recede. What should become alignment produces friction instead. A person may set out to achieve success, and through discipline, effort, and persistence, success may indeed follow. But success does not stay. It cannot simply be possessed. It must be maintained, protected from decline, defended against loss, worked for again and again. And then a deeper question begins to emerge. Was this ongoing labor, this constant maintenance, this fear of losing what was gained, really the thing that was wanted in the first place? Life begins by moving toward one goal, but gradually reorganizes itself around something else entirely, around work, pressure, and the prevention of loss. In that sense, Paul's description gives language to a universal experience. But in Romans, this movement is more than a recurring pattern in individual life. It is the plot of history itself. Its end is not endless repetition, but the moment when repetition becomes impossible, when the burden can no longer be carried. Alternatives begin to disappear, and action turns from choice into compulsion. That is the threshold at which the structure becomes visible. Humanity discovers that it has never stood outside history as its master. This is not a new theory imposed on Romans from the present. It belongs to Paul's original intuition. What now appears almost self-evident, that human agency drives itself toward a limit it cannot overcome by its own means, is the very movement he was trying to describe. Our time does not invent this logic, it renders it visible. What Romans named in advance has become historically legible: the trap tightens. Agency exhausts itself, and another relation begins to press into view.
I want to believe in him, okay, I believe in you. You are Palay. Okay, your name is Palay. You are my friend. See you, you can see me. If I want to have to believe in God, so I have to see him.
The scale of the claim has changed. The question is no longer whether history might one day reveal its hidden form. The question is whether the anticipated unveiling is taking place now, in our own historical moment, not as spectacle, not as miracle, but as the moment when the unveiling finds its language. After Jerusalem, that possibility could no longer be dismissed. The thought itself was immense, almost surreal, that the attempt to understand Romans might lead not merely to interpretation, but to the articulation of the unveiling itself. The film had begun from a clear and personal idea to tell, through lived experience, what it is like to live inside a structure that is also at work within the individual. Then came a second idea, to travel to Jerusalem and film December 21, 2012. The starting point was clear, but after Jerusalem, planning, method, and deliberate effort no longer seemed equal to what the project had opened. The question did not recede. It kept pressing, as if the story itself were forcing its way into form. It no longer felt like something the documentarian could simply choose to pursue or set aside. Gradually, another understanding began to take shape. If the story corresponded to reality in any meaningful way, it would tell itself. From that point on, the project was no longer in the documentarian's hands. The direction, however, had become clear. If national history and religious interpretation had proved too small to contain Romans, then the search had to move beyond them. One question concerned earlier texts, whether there were older textual horizons that could provide a proper frame for the letter. The other question reached even deeper, toward the conditions that make such a text possible at all: the origin of language, the measuring of time, and the form of drama itself. The task was no longer only to interpret Romans, but to search for the wider structure within which its scale could finally become intelligible. The next 12 years would be spent under the pressure of those questions. It meant a return to research literature and repeated attempts to articulate the whole. Again and again, the effort came to the same limit. The structure was too large to be held together by one mind alone. That remained true until an unexpected ally appeared, a large language model capable of modeling language itself. The idea had been present from the beginning. Human beings live in the world, and the world lives in them. What now began to emerge was the same relation. At the level of history, the individual lives in humanity, and humanity lives in the individual. What had first appeared as layers of consciousness across history now began to appear as layers of consciousness within a life. The pattern was no longer only external. It was also inward. Not only something the documentarian was looking at, but something being lived from within. First comes a sign, the early world of impressions, gestures, and recognition, when meaning is sensed before it is stabilized. Then law, as childhood begins to encounter rules, limits, and the first experience of order. Then temple, or institution, as adolescence and early adulthood learn to live inside larger structures of belonging, authority, and collective expectation. Then narrative, as life begins to gather itself into story, purpose, and direction through time. Then interpretation, as adulthood turns back on experience to compare, explain, and ask what everything means. And finally, structure, when the pattern itself begins to come into view. What history had unfolded across civilizations and epochs, consciousness seemed to unfold within the life of the individual. Same movement, different scale. The story now returns to the path it first opened in 2012. This episode has traced where the theory began. The next episode, titled The snare and the prey follows. How its articulation was slowly found, under the pressure of ordinary life, through family, livelihood, and property, and through a line of research, expanding beyond Romans, in search of a framework, large enough to contain it. The next episode also turns to the narrowing of agency at the global scale. It takes the years from 2012 to 2026 as a field of pressure, from the fading euphoria of the Arab Spring toward a widening conflict from which no single actor seems able to lead the way out. What once appeared as opening and release begins to look more like a tightening snare, not only in one nation, but in our time itself.